The Sandy Cemeteries podcast is a Mindgarden Media podcast in association with
Screw You, Todd
Productions.
The world we live in is ever-changing. We can learn a lot from the dead. I'm Sandy Jean, your host, and this is Sandy Cemeteries, Tracing History. We'll learn about some of the oldest towns in the nation, as well as the interesting people who are buried there. Ready? Let's go. Nestled into a residential neighborhood in Syracuse, New York, sits a very large historic cemetery known as Oakwood Cemetery. The following was taken from the Oakwood Cemetery website. Since its founding in 1859, Oakwood Cemetery has played a dual role in the life of the Salt City. A tranquil and beautiful resting place for the deceased, it is also a historic, picturesque landscape filled with art and architecture, carefully planned for the enjoyment and enrichment of the living. The original sections, located on the west side of today's 160-acre cemetery, are historically important as examples of a 19th century landscaping style, the rural cemetery. Of considerable interest as well is the grand array of monuments and mausoleums, which form a virtual outdoor museum of funerary sculpture and architecture while mirroring the lives of Syracuse's Victorian families. Unlike burial grounds in the city, the rural cemetery was to be an attractive and civilized place to bury loved ones. Oakwood's founders chose a large section of land that included a hill, springs, valleys, steep slopes, and sturdy oaks. The rural cemetery was to be a place of spiritual fulfillment for the living, as well as a resting place for the dead. Oakwood Cemetery was designed to be a place of natural and man-made beauty, where individuals and families could escape their everyday lives and enjoy the surroundings. I first heard of Oakwood about a year ago, just in conversation with someone originally from Syracuse. I was immediately interested. In late spring and early summer, my husband Dave and I have a seasonal campsite in Morrisville, New York, and often take drives into Syracuse to grab a bite to eat or explore a new area. So one Saturday last year, we decided to check it out. I only have one word: amazing. The beauty, the peacefulness, the carefully thought out winding roadways and paths, the elegant and sometimes a little odd structures. It was both overwhelming and fascinating. So fascinating that Dave and I took several trips there over the summer and early fall. Today, I would like to share with you some thoughts and experiences that I've had at Oakwood Cemetery, and also share with you a story that, well, it might not be for the faint of heart. Ready? Let's dive in. As a very strong empath and medium, as well as a true lover of all cemeteries, I can usually pick up on energy in them. Mind you, not all cemeteries have a lot of energy in them. In fact, very few that I've personally visited do. A few examples. St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 in New Orleans does, as does Bachelor's Grove Cemetery just outside of Chicago, Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester, and Oakwood Cemetery, well, Oakwood does indeed. A very strong residual, but also an intelligent energy. There are spirits there that do want to communicate. However, unless you go there with the intention of communicating, it probably won't happen. Ghost hunting in a cemetery is something that I strongly discourage. It's totally a respect thing. However, I do allow them to come to me when I visit a cemetery. I give them that choice with respect, and sometimes they talk back. Case in point, Dave and I were visiting one day last fall and happened to have a K2 meter with us. I tend to bring some of my equipment with me anywhere we go. For those not sure what a K2 meter does, well, it measures the electromagnetic field surrounding it. Paranormal investigators have been using them for years to detect energy that can't be explained with normal means. If used correctly, they are a fantastic tool. Already knowing that the cemetery held a lot of energy, we drove along the winding roads admiring the beauty. I am usually drawn to specific crypts or areas, and we stopped in front of one crypt belonging to a family. Nestled into a hill, it was both beautiful and haunting. I asked Dave to stop and turn down the K2 meter, careful to keep it away from anything that might produce a false reading. We then went on to have a conversation with several members of this family using the K2 meter. Yes and no questions, with intelligent answers. It was just amazing. And yet, in other areas of the cemetery, we had no interaction at all, especially in those areas that are well known for being haunted. Pretty quiet there. That kind of tells you what legends are made of. Now, on to the story of the Krause family mausoleum. The Krause Mausoleum at Oakwood sits atop a hill and was designed in 1884 for John Krause, Sr. It is in a style that can only be described as uniquely funerary. The main body of the Krause tomb appears to be Romanesque Revival or English Gothic, as it was known at the time. Krause wanted to make sure he knew what he was getting when it came to his eternal home. So he had it built in anticipation of his death, rather than have some relative attend to its construction after his death, which would occur 7 years after the completion of the mausoleum. John Krause was an industrialist and capitalist who was known as the wealthiest man in Syracuse and achieved the bulk of his wealth in the wholesale grocery business. Buried in the mausoleum with John are his wife Catherine and their two sons, Daniel Edgar Krause and John Jacob Krause. John Jacob Krause was mayor of Syracuse in 1876. He was also a merchant, a banker. He was the president of Trust and Deposit Company and State Bank of Syracuse, and alderman in 1864 to 1865. John Jacob, the oldest son of the two boys, was born in Canastota, New York in 1834 and died at the age of 51 in 1886. The Krause clan's fame and fortune are still abundantly found in Syracuse today. In fact, a fair percentage of the city of Syracuse bears the Krause name. I was immediately drawn to this mausoleum the very first time that we visited. I asked Dave to stop the car, got out, and climbed the large concrete steps up to the limestone walls and iron door. As I laid my hand on the stone, I could feel a slight vibration, but nothing too out of the ordinary. After stealing a glance inside, couldn't help it, and advising them that I had come with nothing but respect, I bid them farewell and returned to the car. However, I kept thinking about that crypt and why I had been so drawn to it. And why was there a huge chain and lock wrapped around a broken area of the door? A few weeks later, we returned to Oakwood, and I asked Dave to stop at the Krause Mausoleum. It was early fall with some leaves on the ground. I walked up to the crypt to pay my respects. From my left side, I suddenly heard a rustling, but not the rustling of, say, a squirrel, and there were plenty. It was heavy, as if maybe a deer or a person were walking down the hill on the other side of the small dirt road where Dave was parked. I looked to my left, nothing. No deer, no person, nothing. I turned back to the Krause family and heard it again. And then again. Still nothing. At that point, I became nervous, which is not something that happens to me often, by the way. Just ask Todd. I was unnerved, though. I felt an energy that I didn't like. And so I quickly made my way back to the car. It was only after this encounter that I learned the following. On October 17, 1988, Syracuse University freshman and art student Kevin McQuain broke into the Krause family mausoleum and stole the head of John Jacob Krause. He had planned on using it in one of his sculpture classes. He brought it back to his nearby dorm. You see, SU, or Syracuse University, is adjacent to Oakwood Cemetery. you can actually see the buildings from the cemetery. And a lot of college students walk through or do homework or just relax in the peacefulness of Oakwood Cemetery. He then proceeded to try and clean the former mayor's head by boiling it with bleach in a trash can placed on the stove of the third-floor common area. Residents were alarmed by the stench, and even more so when they discovered the source. McQueen and two of his friends were arrested. McQueen pled guilty in 1989. The charges against his accomplices were dropped, yet all three received the same sentence, 200 hours of community service for this grotesque and insane act. Universities tend to frown upon students who cook the heads of their benefactors. McQueen's scholarship was understandably revoked. Later newspaper articles state that he left Syracuse due to a lack of funds, but he did complete his undergraduate education at Alfred University. According to another later news article, his friends dubbed him Scully, and he decided, to embrace it. He went on to form a goth rockabilly record label called Scully Records, which he apparently still runs himself as a side hustle to his everyday technical services job. As an empath and a medium, I tend to be drawn to things, objects, people, locations, buildings, and always for a reason. I believe that if I am communicated with, it's because a story needs to be told. After learning about the Krause family mausoleum defilement, I had to wonder, was I being called to that crypt so that I could tell that story? And who, or what, was lurking on the other side of the dirt road that time that I visited? It was obvious that my attention was being asked for. I have purposely stayed about as far from that mausoleum as I possibly could since that last visit. We don't even go on the road anymore. Maybe, in light of my recent discoveries, it'll be time for another visit in the spring. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Sandy's Cemeteries, Tracing History. You can find the link to the Oakwood Cemetery website in the show notes for this episode. I highly recommend that you set aside a good amount of time to just take it all in and enjoy if you do decide to visit. It's a beautiful and actually very peaceful way to spend an hour or two, or more. Check out our other podcasts, the Sandy and Toddcast and the Empathicary podcast, on any of the platforms that you normally find your podcasts, including YouTube and Twitter. Be sure to like the Sandy and Toddcast on Facebook to keep up on the latest goings-on, including each week's new episode. You can also join our group Stay Weirdos Friends of the Sandy and Toddcast for more fun. We're like a big family there. It's a safe place to share your thoughts, feelings, ideas, and random inappropriate memes without judgment.